So we have been working through the book of Acts here at University Assembly. So this is your first time. This is a message that's outside of our normal routine of preaching through books of the Bible. One of the reasons why we preach through books of the Bible here is because I'm young and dumb, and I might get too taken with what's happening in culture or feel the pressure to be relevant all the time. And so our preaching team got together before we even planted the church and talked about the importance of being rooted in God's word and not being tossed about by every cultural movement. Now, all that being said, today we're going to talk about a cultural movement today. And I just want you to know we'll be diving back into the book of Acts next week. Elder Chris will be preaching that message, so you want to come back for that. I'm really excited to hear him preach the word. But every once in a while, in fact, this is the first time this year that I've been able to preach on a topic that's totally up to me, and I chose to talk about Christian engagement in politics and culture. I want to set a couple of things up here right at the front so that way I can hopefully just let some of the tension out of the room. I won't be talking about political parties today. I won't be talking about individual politicians of our day. And so this is a nonpartisan yet principally based message this morning. So hopefully we can all relax and kind of take this in without writing down any punch points for me at the end. Hopefully my inbox isn't full after this message. I want to talk to you this morning about what it means to be found faithful by God. I think a great summary of living a Christian life well is being found faithful by God. We all want to hear those words in the end, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." And so that means that we live a life of service and ministry to others. It means that we behave in ways that are good and in accordance with God's good character. But it also means that we're faithful in everything that we do. And what that means to God is that we're faithful to Him, and we show our allegiance in everything that we do to God and God alone. And that's not easy to do today. I don't think it's ever been easy to do. We are human, we're fallen, and so we're prone to be creatures of habit. We're creatures that desire power, desire pleasure, comfort, those things that will constantly distract us from having a primary allegiance to God and His principles and His commands. And so today I want to talk a little bit about what that life looks like when you're found faithful by God. And I could think of no better example than the 5 that I'm going to give you today, the first 3 of which are directly from Scripture, characters that hopefully you'll recognize from Scripture. And then the other 2 are a little bit 20th century. Luther in the Reformation times, and then Dietrich Bonhoeffer in the 20th century. So I want to look at these examples of being found faithful, and I want to argue for 2 universal principles this morning. Okay, so the first one is, to be found faithful, Christians must become impossible people. And that term, that phrase, an impossible person, usually has a very negative connotation to it. That person is impossible in the workplace. They don't bend, they're inflexible, they're rigid. There is a way in which that's a good thing, and we'll talk about that, and we'll kind of look at that in the examples. The second one is, to be found faithful, Christians must not be utilitarians. Now, that just means the use of any means to justify a certain end. That means you can't be Robin Hood and provide for the poor by stealing from the rich. What we do matters before God. We can't corrupt our principles and our actions before God, even if it's to achieve something good. Okay? So we're going to kind of look at how that works in the examples I'm going to put before you today. But let me unpack first what it means to be an impossible person. There's this character in first century Roman Empire named Pliny the Younger. And Pliny the Younger was this nasty fella who always was advising Emperor Trajan to execute Christians. Christians were this ever-blossoming community that tended to cause uproar in all the cities in which Paul and Peter and others were planting churches because they were disrupting the order between the Jewish communities and the Roman communities in the cities in which they lived. And so from a Roman perspective, they're troublemakers, right? They're always causing discord. They're always raising up strife in the city because Jews persecute them and Romans persecute them, and even battles would take place inside cities. And so Christians were considered in the first century as troublemakers. Now, in one of the letters that we have from Pliny to Emperor Trajan, Pliny describes Christians this way. This is a quote from Pliny the Younger. "Whatever the nature of their admission," this is Christians, "I am convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought not to go unpunished." So Pliny is in a time where Christians are literally being put on spikes in the way into major cities in the Roman Empire. And he's describing the characterization of what Christians are like. They're stubborn and they're obstinate. Why? Because they're unwilling to forego their allegiance to God to worship the emperor. Christians were all the time being killed in the first century because they wouldn't denounce Jesus. They wouldn't let go of that primary allegiance, and it usually cost them dearly with their life. Some were put into the Colosseum and fed to lions, or used in theatrical presentations where they were killed live on stages. This was a terrible time to be Christians. But what does Pliny say about them? That they're weak, that they're a plague that we just have to get rid of? No, they're stubborn. They're obstinate to the political and cultural milieu of their day. They're impossible people. What I take from this is that we as Christians must demonstrate our confidence in the gospel by a courage that is prepared to break with all that contradicts what God says. That means that any time that we're confronted in the political sphere or culture, it's never an option for the Christian to choose the culture or the political end over God's end. And that's incredibly difficult to do. So I'm going to unpack this hopefully in story to help us see how to do that well. I think we as Christians must wager our comfort, our livelihood, our honor, and our very lives on God and His Word against all other claims of authority. In short, we must be found faithful by being impossible people. And I realize that when I give these examples, it might not land very well because we're just so comfortable here. No one had to fight a Roman guard to get here this morning, or slip out at night and camp out in the backyard so you could worship here. But just behind me here, you see examples of Coptic Christians who were unwilling, just 1 year ago, unwilling to recant their belief in Jesus Christ, and were ultimately beheaded for that belief. We can be so insulated here in America that we don't know that these problems that first century Christians were facing all of the time are still being faced today. These people are having to make political and cultural decisions with every word that they say, every relationship that they build in the Middle East right now, because any slip up, any wrong word could result in death or imprisonment. This is still a very real issue for today. And so I want us to think about this in more of a global context. Don't think of this as just westernized American Christians. And we should also know, as being good students of history, that times change. Times may be comfortable and peaceful now, but that doesn't mean they always will be. And so what kind of person, what kind of culture, what kind of church do we want? We want to be known as impossible people. So let's get to our first example. Kinsey read the response of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to King Nebuchadnezzar. Let me give some context to this, okay? Jews have been captured and they have been dispersed all over the Babylonian Empire. King Nebuchadnezzar is a Babylonian ruler, okay? And he is known as a person who can be reasonable at times, can be workable at times, and shows even favor to the Jews at certain points. As a matter of fact, these three young Jews were appointed to a level that would have been kind of similar to a county surveyor today, okay? They were popular enough that they they were put into a position where they were able to survey land and make plans for crops and things like that. They were part of the Babylonian establishment in that sense. So they weren't Jews that were totally against Babylon. They were Jews that were working for the good of Babylon in the government, okay? And the Babylonian leaders see these Jews who are coming into their cities and into their culture, and they're flourishing. They're doing well. Why? Because they have these tight-knit families, and they have a tight sense of community, and they're people of principle, and so they tend to flourish. That's always the case with the people of God throughout the Old Testament. They're scattered. They have this renewal where they turn back to God and his ways and his principles. They start to flourish, and their oppressive governments and their oppressive culture starts to take note and get jealous. Well, that's what was happening in Babylon. These Babylonian leaders who were over these young Jews who started to do well even in government decided they were going to find a way to trap these 3 young Jews, and they were going to make King Nebuchadnezzar see that they shouldn't have the authority that they have. And so what do? They erect this statue out in the plains. And they go to King Nebuchadnezzar and they convince him that this statue needs to take place, and it'll be a tribute to his greatness. It'll be a tribute to his gods. And listen, King Nebuchadnezzar, this is what we'll do. We'll make everybody come for the christening of this statue, and we'll make them bow down in worship. And then you can really see who's for you and against you. And so everybody comes, and the statue is built, and it's fine, it's gold, it's huge, it's your typical ancient Near East pagan statue, right? And everybody's around it, and the trumpets go off, and the musical instruments start to play, and everybody knows that it's time to bow down. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, again, part of the Babylonian establishment, don't bow because they don't worship anything that isn't Yahweh, right? They're not going to show that sort of allegiance to a statue or to a leader or to a government when only God gets their worship. And so let me read this bit of text again. After Nebuchadnezzar hears of this, because the Babylonians who orchestrated this and put all this together go to him and whisper, hey, look who wasn't bowing. Did you see this? And so Nebuchadnezzar gets furious and he says, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of these instruments of all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a burning furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? So it's a challenge to their God even. You guys hear about the down to me, I'm going to throw you in the furnace. Then we'll see what happens. Did you guys hear about these 3 characters in Sunday school growing up? Some of you guys out there, the flannelgram version. My Aunt Mary, who's a faithful Christian, would read to me stories out of A Precious Moments. You guys know what those little figurines? A Precious Moments Bible. And I remember even at a young age seeing those big kind of droopy eyes in the flames and thinking, oh my God, this is terrible, right? These 3 figures are in the flames here. What kind of Bible is this, you know? But it's interesting how we focus on the miracle of them being saved in the flames, and we don't often highlight their faithfulness. True, it's an absolute miracle that God delivered them from those flames, and he did a mighty work that ended up being very persuasive to the Babylonian culture that he was in fact God. But for our purposes today, I want you to see their response to King Nebuchadnezzar here. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. He just said he's going to throw them in a furnace, right? If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he does not your majesty's hand. This is the key. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. These folks are impossible people. They're confronted by the powers of their day, and they're given an ultimatum, right? Serve me, serve my God, serve us, or be thrown to the flames that you know are waiting for you. And they coolly, calmly say, we won't. And even if God doesn't save us, we won't worship you or your gods. These are impossible people. Now, I told you we're talking about two different universal principles today. Being an impossible person is part of being a Christian, right? And the second idea of not being a utilitarian, not using any means necessary to get a good end. Now, what could they have done? They're in a huge group of people bowing to some statue they don't believe in or care about. Could they have just bowed down and just been hidden? Could they have been sick that day? Or all these different things they could have done to negotiate their way out of this situation. They could have done anything. But these individuals were principled. They weren't going to worship anything, and they weren't going to be shy about their lack of worship to idols. They were going to behave as the officials ought to behave. They went to the ceremony and they abstained from worshiping the idol. They were not utilitarian. They didn't seek their own good end. In fact, they were willing to give their lives as impossible people. Then let's look at their friend, Daniel. Daniel is a contemporary of these three young Jews. And Daniel has a little bit more status in the Babylonian Empire. This is what I love too. The Babylonian Empire is very perverse and wicked. And yet there's these strategic positions that have been made available and open to Jews, and they've worked their way up into these positions. And they exemplify in those positions in the city and the state the character and nature of God in their positions. Daniel's an incredibly political book. It's usually known just for its prophecy, but it's very political, and it's a great book to teach us how to engage secular culture. But Daniel has something of a position that would be kind of like a mayor today. He's in charge of a big city or a big area, okay? And he's kind of one of those stars on the rise, and the Babylonian leaders feel this again. He's moving towards something that would be more similar to a governorship. The King Darius loves him. He adores him. He weeps when he finds out that Daniel's going to be thrown to the lion's den. Daniel has favor in the city, okay? And he's a leader. He's part of the political realm. Let's read here in chapter 6, verse 3. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. He had this standard of excellence that he brought to his work, and the king noticed. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. All right? This is common politics, right? Let's look and see what this person on the rise has done wrong and bring that to the forefront of the political sphere. Daniel and his conduct of government affairs. But they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. That's how we want to be known. And we haven't even got to the impossible part yet, right? He's just a good guy who exemplifies good work ethic, and he has good character, and they're searching for something wrong and they can't find it. And then these same leaders come to King Darius, and they know that King Darius likes Daniel. They know that he's a leader on the rise because he has favor with Darius. And Darius is tricked into making a decree against worshiping any god but himself or his gods for 30 days. Daniel hears of the decree but continues to worship God 3 times daily in the privacy of his home. I like that aspect too. He's not overt in his worship to the extent that he's being some obnoxious person. So don't equate impossible with obnoxious, right? But he is principled, and he goes home 3 times a day. If you've been going home 3 times a day for years and your political enemies know that you do that to worship your God, if you're trying to escape their trap, you're going to go pray somewhere else probably. That's not what Daniel does. Daniel goes home 3 times a day and prays to the Lord. And look at this response by King Darius. King Darius is distressed and wants to free Daniel. He had a decree to get Daniel out of this situation, but he can't. he made this ironclad decree, and any relent on that would undermine his authority. So Daniel's sentenced, and he's thrown into the lion's den that very evening. At dawn, the stone is rolled away, and Daniel says, as King Darius is there, thinking he's going to find his friend mangled from the lions, "May the king, God, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty." That principle kept him strong. And even in the response the next day, he's building that relationship with the king. This is really key here to understanding the importance of this story. Daniel is not some retreatist zealot. He is in leadership. He's in the Babylonian circles. And even after being fed to the lions, or attempted to, he goes back to his position in the government. How many of us would do that? This king, even though he was a friend, threw him in the lion's den. Daniel survives, keeps his good character, and does well and flourishes in the Babylonian Empire even after this event. He's an impossible person. Can you imagine just the anger you would have felt as some of those Babylonian leaders the next day? One of the darker parts about the Bible is this, just seeing how things operated in this day and time. And those leaders were actually thrown to the lions after they tried to trick Darius. Bad move. Having character, having principle, and standing on that principle is what it means to be an impossible person. Daniel could have escaped this by praying to God, by closing the curtain, by doing other things, right? He didn't. He didn't act in such a way to dishonor God. This next example, I won't spend too much time on since we've spent several months on the life of Paul, and this example should be recalled by most of you here pretty quickly. Paul is imprisoned falsely for starting a riot at the temple, right? He didn't start a riot. He was actually there to perform a religious act to make peace with the Jews in Jerusalem. And there were some Jews there who knew about him, including the Gentiles, into God's plan for salvation and reconciliation. And they called him out and started a riot in the temple. And when Paul has to be taken out of there, almost care-flighted out of there by Roman soldiers, right? They run up the stairs, and Paul says, "Wait, let me tell them one more thing." And he preaches the gospel and says it's also for the Gentiles to the crowd. Now that's standing on principle, right? These people are ready to kill him, and he's still willing to preach in a way that's faithful to the gospel. Paul's in prison for 2 years after this, okay? He stays in prison, falsely accused for 2 years. And we know that, that Paul could have given the governor Felix a bribe. It says, at the same time he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, Felix, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. Over the course of these 2 years, the governor constantly pulled Paul into his inner circle to try and get him to give him money. Some commentators said the bribe could have been as little as 6 months' wages. That could have got him out. And Paul knows this, but he stays because he's called by God to reach Rome. And even after his time in prison with Felix, he's before Agrippa, and he did that because he knows the Caesar. And Agrippa, confused at why Paul would do that because he knows that he could have set Paul free. Paul knows that he's called to go to Rome and to give an account. Listen to what Agrippa says to Paul. Then Agrippa said to Paul, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" Because Paul, in his trial, tries to convince Agrippa to be a Christian, right? In the trial itself. Paul replied, "Short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains." Paul gave everything to the gospel. The king rose, and with him the governor and Bernice and those sitting with them. They began saying to each other, "This man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. Paul was principled. He was impossible. He was aggravating even the judge who wanted to set him free. But Paul was called by God to reach Rome. And he wasn't willing to bend, to bribe, to lie. Paul, in all of his testimony, denies the false accusations against him. He just remains principled and true. He becomes an impossible person. This next example is Martin Luther. One of my favorite theologians. I love the story arc of his life. He's such an interesting character. If you don't know the story of the Reformation, let me tell you in 30 seconds what happened in the Reformation, right? So Martin Luther is this monk who would have been maybe the equivalent of an associate pastor in a small city at a small church, okay? He's not some big name guy. Nobody really knows who he is, right? But he makes a trip to Rome, and he makes a trip to different cities where he wants to hear certain theologians speak, okay, with his mentor. And he comes to the building site of St. Peter's Basilica, and there's a man named Johann Tetzel there. And Johann Tetzel is this bad dude, okay? He's this guy that the Pope hires when the coffers are low. Okay, Johann Tetzel makes his appearance whenever the building project gets a little thin. And so what is Johann Tetzel doing there? He's on the steps of one of the cathedrals there, and he's preaching to a large crowd, and he's telling them, if you just give some indulgences, some money to the church, we will write the name of your loved one down, and we will make sure that loved one who has been deceased will be released from purgatory and enter heaven. This is what Johann Tetzel was doing. And Martin Luther, kind of this ho-hum rural theologian, is making his way through the city, and he hears this. And he's thinking, this is not the gospel. This isn't what Jesus came and died for. These weird buy me out of jail, get me out of purgatory limbo situations. And so Luther goes home and he writes this prolific set of doctrine called the 95 Theses. And before he nails it to a church door, he actually sends it to a bishop. He doesn't want to split the church up over this. He had no clue what was going to happen from this. He sends it to a local bishop and is dismissed. And in an anger and a fit of rage, he takes those documents and he nails them to the church door in Wittenberg. And it becomes this event that turns the entire Christian world upside down. Luther is brought before the Pope and brought before many different trials, and there's a famous trial where he's literally in front of the Pope, and the Pope asks him to recant. Luther, we can take care of this today if you just say what you said was not true. If you just bend a little bit on this principle, you're splitting the whole church apart. You're really turning the whole world upside down. Just say it isn't so, and you can go back to the way things are. Luther says, I would rather die than recant. And he sticks to his principles and ends up ripping the whole church apart. Up until that point, most of the church splitting that had been done had been done in the far east section of the world, and the Western church had been a stable force for hundreds of years. And one man standing on principle, and that principle was salvation by grace through faith, which most of us Protestants here believe today. That principle and that theological doctrine and his commitment to that split the world apart. When I was reading through this again, I thought how often we justify bending our principles to save something good. We take that responsibility, that's God's responsibility, on our shoulders, and we bend because we want a good outcome. Utilitarian, right? We bend on our principles, we become flexible because we want things to be okay in the end. But that's God's responsibility. We've been called to be faithful to what God has taught and said. Martin Luther was certainly an impossible person, and I could go into his gregarious personality, but we don't have time for that. My last final example here is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, another personal hero of mine. We didn't agree on much theologically, he would be in a very different camp and a different church than I would be in this morning. But his commitment to Christian ethics and his commitment to Jesus and the gospel caused him great angst and never allowed him to become comfortable with the state of the church in World War II. Bonhoeffer was an ordained minister in the Lutheran Church. He was also a scholar, a professor at the University of Berlin, and he was charged with raising up the next generation of Lutheran ministers there in Germany at the time of World War II. He was a pacifist, and so he didn't believe in war, and his teachings often got him in trouble with Nazi Germany, obviously because war was ramping up. He was often a critic of Germany in World War I, and so his teachings would often put him at odds with the government officials and the culture of his day. So eventually, Bonhoeffer leaves Germany, and he goes kind of on this quest to learn more about other cultures, and really he was fleeing a Germany that was getting hot in terms of persecution of people who opposed the Lutheran Church that accepted so much of what Hitler and Nazi Germany was putting forward. Bonhoeffer eventually comes back to Germany because he believes that the church has a moral responsibility to stand up to Hitler and Nazi Germany. He begins teaching at what were called underground seminaries. He was teaching an underground movement in the Lutheran Church, ways in which their theology conflicted with Nazi Germany, and he was persuading young Lutherans to be active and be political in the public square and denouncing Nazi Germany. Bonhoeffer was eventually found out. He was actually a courier for a group that was plotting to kill Hitler. And Bonhoeffer was found out, and he was arrested. And Bonhoeffer, a pacifist, took responsibility for his actions. Bonhoeffer was unique in that he was a pacifist, but he believed that it was a moral duty to stop someone like Hitler, even if it meant killing. And here's how he justifies this. This is a person of principle, okay? The ultimate question for a responsible man, Bonhoeffer says, to ask is not how he is to extricate himself heroically from the affair, but how the coming generation shall continue to live. How are we going to continue to exist in this state? Bonhoeffer says, when a man takes guilt upon himself and responsibility, he imputes his guilt to himself and no one else. He answers for it. Before other men, he is justified by dire necessity. So he's reflecting on what it's going to mean if he actually is successful in killing Hitler. Other men will see the necessity of the situation and call it good, he's saying. Before himself, he is acquitted by his conscience. His conscience was leading him to do this act. He's saying, I'm okay in my conscience about it. But before God, he hopes only for grace. He realizes that killing is wrong. And I'm not a pacifist, but I respect him for taking that on to himself and being willing to stand so firm in his principles that he was willing to give up everything. He lost his professorship. He was censored. He couldn't speak in public. The Gestapo was watching him every time he left his house. He lost all of his rights before he was imprisoned. He lost his standing in the Lutheran Church. He was excommunicated. He gave up everything in his life for principle. I'm certainly an impossible person. Now, I realize this, okay? We can look at these incredible, fantastic examples and go, no one's throwing me in a lion's den. No one's trying to put me in a furnace. This isn't applicable to my life directly. And I would say that it is. And I think we have to look at the spectrum of political and cultural engagement to really see what this looks like. Often we're called to be utilitarian. We're often asked to compromise certain principles to get something good in the end. Again, utilitarian is use of any means to justify a certain end. This position will justify any political or cultural activity to secure a certain outcome, even if it's good. It might be personal safety, it might be religious freedom. But principles are compromised in the end to achieve a good end. Even Bonhoeffer, in a way, was saying that he was in this camp. He was willing to traverse his principle of pacifism to kill Hitler in order to bring about a good. And he said he was guilty of that before God. We also see a lack of a retreatist mentality in these examples, leaving politics and culture to their own devices. A clear example of this would be Quakers or Anabaptists in our country that completely withdraw themselves from voting in the political and cultural sphere. They often create their own communities to live out their values with little care or desire what happens in the broader culture or the political realm. This is a retreatist mentality. And there's theological reasons for this. There's many Anabaptist theologians I respect that hold this position. But in those examples I gave you, I don't see this retreatist mindset taking place. I think of Daniel going right back in to the belly of the beast, if you will, and resuming his position in the Babylonian Empire to bring about good for his city and for his people. I don't think we're called to be utilitarians who compromise on our principles. I don't think that we're called to retreat and simply hide in our homes. And a less clear but more pervasive example of this retreatist mindset is Christians in America who think that anything political is bad and therefore never engage politics as though there will be no consequence for doing so. I know I'm going to step on some toes here, okay? But any time in culture there's a vacuum from what's good vacating the public square, okay? So if good people leave culture and civics and politics, it creates a vacuum. And that vacuum is always filled with something. Someone's going to lead the city. Someone's going to lead the government. And so I don't think as Christians who are called to live good lives for the common good of our cities, who are called to live lives that reflect the very nature and character of God, are called to create a vacuum that's then filled with all sorts of evil and negative consequences in our culture. So I know that it's tempting. I am wore out with our culture. I am wore out with our politics. And I am a political junkie. I keep up with all this stuff. I'm wore out by this. It is our duty to do good in our cities, to be good and make culture in our cities. And so I argue for this third position, okay? This is a way of seeing and doing and voting and acting in our culture and in our politics. I would say to participate and even support politics and culture as far as principle allows us to. Again, in the story of the 3 young Jews, they go back to their positions and they flourish in Babylon. Daniel goes back to his position and he flourishes. Paul is always working for the good of the people around him. I think we're called to be deeply principled people, and those principles rest on the very character of God. And we should continue to engage and serve and hold positions in our city as long as we're able to do so, holding the principles that God commands. And, in these examples, again, it's kind of extreme. You're probably not going to be asked, if you're a city council member, to go to a field and bow down to a gold statue in Colorado Springs, or probably any city in the country. That's probably not going to be asked of you. But you might be asked to fudge some numbers on a report. You might be asked to gloss over an issue that could upset the whole city to get some end. You might be asked in your workplace to just sit on a workplace situation and don't file that report or that harassment claim for a while. Don't talk about what you saw in that corner. We're supposed to be impossible people today, too. We're supposed to be people who know their principles and live by them. So here are 3 application points and we're done, okay? 3 points. First, know what you're willing to die for. Again, none of you are probably worrying about death right now by the government or by some cultural oppression. But you don't want to wait until that day comes to decide what it is you'll die for. If you discover what it is in the gospel and in the story of Scripture and in your relationship with God, if you decide what it is you're willing to die for, You'll then be able to live for those things as well. So it's not just considering what you'll die for. What are you going to live for? Know what you are not willing to compromise long before you enter a voting booth or a political season. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm not going to tell you any of those things, right? But you, as an individual who has the power to punch a ballot, you need to decide before we get into a season where the media and every single cultural thing is trying to pull us in different directions. You have to decide what's important to you before you get to that day and that season. This, for Christians, means knowing who God is and what pleases him. The more we understand who God is and his character, and we are going to try to do that in our preaching here. I want you to know more about God than how to feel good about yourself. I think the more you see God clearly, the easier voting and civic duty and all of those things become, because you know who God is and what pleases him. And you'll know when the day comes what to do. 2, be known for what you are living for. Be known for what you're living for. Notice that our examples didn't die over the date of the rapture, right? They didn't die over some little doctrine that really isn't of great importance. They wouldn't bow down and worship an idol. That's a core idea in Christianity and in Judaism. We're not going to worship anything but God. Flesh that out in your own life. What are those things in the center that you will die for, and be known for lifting those things up and carrying those things with joy? Notice how our examples were not taking risks to strong-arm their beliefs on a dominant culture. Notice how Daniel didn't kick that rock down and come out of there and said, yeah, now all you guys are going to be worshiping Yahweh. I'm going to start a movement. No, there's this humility. This is the God I serve. This is the God who finds me righteous in his sight. King, I didn't do anything wrong by you. And he humbly walks back into his station in the government. And King Darius actually decrees that all will worship the God of Daniel when it's done. He was known for what he was for. They were killed or tried to be killed for their allegiance to God. They were known for their faithfulness in the end. Here's our third application point. Come on, clicker. Vote in a way that reflects what you value. Vote in a way that reflects what you value. Don't get caught comfortable. Okay? Think about these things long ahead of time, long before you're going into a voting booth. November is coming soon. And I'm not going to stop our study in Acts to talk about voting at that point. Here's my little disclaimer. Think about how you're going to vote, if you're going to vote, whatever you choose to do. Do so out of the principles that you believe in. Don't get caught comfortable. We are not being thrown to the lions today, but we do vote, which can often feel like being thrown to the lions. Sometimes we have impossible decisions before us. And no one wants to pick either one of the two, and you don't have to all the time. That's not a popular opinion in this country. I realize that. But as a Christian, you have a first and primary allegiance to your relationship and your allegiance to God. And if you, as an individual before God, cannot go into a voting booth and haven't done your homework, don't know which one ought to be picked, if you go into the voting booth and you're picking between two choices that don't honor God, you don't have to pick one. I'm going to leave that there before I get in trouble. Yeah. Vote in a way that reflects your values. If you're going to vote, vote in a way that demonstrates your allegiance to God. So as we prepare for communion, every week we have a communion reflection. And I hope that reading through and thinking through these 5 examples, we've been able to see what it looks like to be an impossible person. And noticing how sometimes these individuals were annoying. Sometimes these individuals were pestering. Sometimes these individuals gummed up all the big plans of a group. But what was always the case afterward was an admiration of their faithfulness and their character and their principles. That's the burden we have before God. We can't control what's going to happen on the Supreme Court, in Congress, in our relationship with other countries. We can control how faithful we are to God and His commands. So let's ask ourselves as we take the bread and the cup this morning, are we impossible people? Will we be found faithful by God because we've committed ourselves to who He is, to what He's called us to do? Do we love our cities and serve them in a way where they know that we love our cities and we will serve them, but they come second to God? Let's pray over our communion elements this morning as the elders make their way forward and thank God for His sacrifice on the cross. Lord, help us become impossible people, set against the world for the sake of the world. Teach us to be resolved in your ways and to commit ourselves to you, O God. As we take this cup and this bread, symbols of your atonement on the cross, we are reminded of the nonviolent way of Christ, who changes the world even today because He died for His enemies. Lord, allow us to be principled, impossible people who are joyful in our worship of you. In our love for you, Lord, let us win many over to your side and to your kingdom. Lord, it is a blessing and a privilege and an honor to worship you. This morning, as we take the bread and the cup, we worship you and you alone. We ask that you bless this time and accept this as a sacrifice of our time and our energy, Lord, as an act of worship to you. We ask you to do all these things in your heavenly name. Amen.